Section 12 of Music by Ursula Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, The Father of Modern Music. When Bach died, he had written the most perfect contrapuntal music that the world has ever heard. But new ways of writing music were being used, which did not depend so entirely on counterpoint. And later on, even if musicians did use counterpoint and its imitations, they used other ways as well of making music. Some of these new ways had been used in popular songs and dances, but not in the learned and artistic music. Music is not like other arts, where the means remain the same at different periods. For instance, in sculpture at any period of the world's history, if people have understood how to carve in stone, they have been able to express their spirit in sculpture. But in music it is different. Each age and each people has had different means with which to make music, different instruments, different scales, different ways of using notes. So at one time there may be a perfect music made with certain means, and at another time an equally perfect music made with quite other means. We have seen that in Queen Elizabeth's days, before instruments were well understood, and before the old modes had narrowed to the two scales we now use, composers had written perfect contrapuntal music for voices. Later, Bach had written a new kind of beautiful contrapuntal music for instruments. And for the instruments that were understood in his day, the organ, clavichord, and string instruments, like the violin and cello, he wrote music that has never been equaled. After Bach, composers began to discover interests of harmony and key that had hardly been understood in his day. The violin composers, who were now developing the technique of their instrument and finding out gradually how to play it with all the effects we hear today, made the violin a solo instrument. Any instrument played with it was simply an accompaniment. So when composers wrote a melody or theme, they made it very tuneful or very rhythmic and very definitely in one key. A melody that was not used to combine with other melodies or with bits of itself could be much more free, more in the nature of what we should call a tune than a contrapuntal melody was. So a new simple kind of melody began to be used. Another interest was the beautiful tone and the special powers of expression which could be developed from each instrument. Different qualities of tone had not mattered so much when parts answering each other and imitating each other provided constant contrasts. But when one instrument was used alone, the different kinds of sound it could make and their beauty, and all the effects that could be produced by playing loud or soft, all this became important and added fresh delights. When a piece consisted of the short, not very free melodies that are suitable to counterpoint, it could not last very long without a feeling that the themes were being used to weariness. But when a piece contains several different tunes, and the interest of passing from one key to another, and then the expectancy of the tune coming back to the original key, it is clear that a new departure had been made in the writing of music. And so it became possible for long instrumental works to be written without their seeming long or dull. As a result of these developments, composers made a new form or shape for pieces of instrumental music. They would begin a piece with a tuneful or vigorous theme in one key, then move to another key which made a good contrast to the first. And in this second key, there would be a new theme, or more than one, all giving a definite impression of this new, fresh key. Then would come passages of what is called modulation, that is, the movement from one key to another. But at last the music would come back to the first key, and then the various themes were all repeated to make that key final and definite. This shape of a piece of music depends on the harmony, the chords that are used to make the original keys sound definite and to make the new keys sound like a surprise or freshness. And finally, to make our ears feel the completeness of the return to the first key at the end of the piece. Such music is called harmonic music, and the special form of it just described is known as sonata form. It was used for long pieces for the clavier or piano and also for other instruments, such pieces as violin sonatas and string quartets, also in the compositions for orchestra, which we call symphonies. Musicians still use dances and the shorter forms, such as A. Scarlatti had used in his arias and Bach in his instrumental suites, but they wrote long, important movements in this new way. It must be remembered that Bach and his contemporaries had not written any music for orchestra as we understand it. For although he had written the Brandenburg concertos, which are beautifully adapted for different instruments playing together, this was purely contrapuntal music and therefore different in its effect from modern orchestral music. In Bach's music, the separateness and distinctness of each instrument matters, whereas in modern orchestral music, the way the different instruments combine together to make new blendings of sound is the thing of greatest importance. So much has been done since Bach lived to develop the resources of some instruments, or as we should say, to improve their technique, that many effects are possible which in Bach's day would have been impossible because no player could have been found who could play them. The first great musician who is always remembered for writing symphonies, those long works for many instruments which we now hear, was Haydn. And he is also remembered as the first musician to write string quartets as we understand them now. That is, works written in several movements for 4 solo string instruments: first violin, second violin, viola, and cello. Franz Joseph Haydn, 1732 to 1809, came from a very musical nation, the Croatians. He was born in a little Austrian village not far from the Danube. His father, who was a wheelwright, was very fond of the harp, and in the evenings he sat at his door playing and singing with his wife and children the many popular songs of the countryside. Haydn never forgot those songs. Their tunes and rhythms are often found in the beautiful music he wrote in later life. In the old contrapuntal music, the tunes of popular folk songs or hymn tunes or dances were only used as a basis for all sorts of flowing contrapuntal melodies. But music was changing now, and real tunes, real peasant songs and dances, were written in serious long works and made the spirit and gaiety of a movement. Little Haydn was only 6 years old when a relative took him away from home and sent him to a school where he learned to be a good singer and to play a little on various instruments. He got on so well that he was offered a place as choir boy in Vienna. His education and singing went on in the choir school, but he was not taught to write music at all. However, he was always composing, and when his voice broke and he was turned out of the choir with no money and no prospects, he took pupils and worked still harder at composing and studying music by other composers. One composer whose works he especially studied was Philipp Emanuel Bach, a son of the famous Johann Sebastian Bach, and it was in his sonatas for clavier that Haydn learned the new form or shape for music that he used in writing symphonies. As he made more friends and became better known, he was asked to a country house where there was an orchestra, and here he wrote his first pieces for orchestra. Orchestral pieces in those days were not always long, important works. Many were short, light pieces written for the daily concerts that took place in noblemen's houses. And they were called by many different names: symphony, serenade, notturno, cassation, divertimento. Many noblemen had private bands or orchestras, and much music was written for them. Haydn's lonely studies had helped him to be really original. His works were full of gaiety and freshness and melody, and his best work was far more interesting and alive than the other music of his time. He was 28 years old when Prince Anton Esterhazy, who lived at Eisenstadt in Hungary, appointed him to direct his private orchestra. It was quite small, but the players were good, and for 30 years Haydn lived with the prince. It was a very regular, quiet life passed in the country. Every morning and afternoon Haydn composed. He never began without being carefully dressed, And later in life, if he felt he was going to write something specially important and beautiful, he put on as well the ring which the King of Prussia had given him. Then every day there were concerts of music, when Haydn and all the other musicians had to wear the uniform of the prince. And there was regular music in church, and sometimes operas were performed. All the other musicians Haydn regarded as his family. They called him Papa Haydn. They looked to him to do all he could for them with the prince, and they were united in their affection for him. This quiet life was only disturbed when important visitors came, and special musical performances were arranged to welcome them, or when once in the year the prince went to Vienna. It was during this quiet life that Haydn wrote an immense amount of music, and his work was so original that though Prince Esterhazy and many musicians of the day appreciated its beauty, the Emperor Joseph and other people who were accustomed to the light, pleasant melodies of Italian operas did not want anything new and found Haydn's music too original. During the yearly visit to Vienna, Haydn met Mozart and made a lifelong friendship. Many musicians were jealous of each other and anxious to outshine each other, but feelings of this sort were impossible to Haydn and Mozart. To them, music was the all-important thing, and each saw the other's genius. Though Haydn was 24 years older than Mozart, he only began to write his symphonies a few years earlier than Mozart, and his best work was written after he had known Mozart for years and studied his work. And Mozart said that it was from Haydn that he learned how to write string quartets. Haydn was never tired of praising Mozart and never spoke of him without feeling. When, as an old man, Haydn went to England, Mozart went to see him off and spent the last few hours in his company. Haydn was nearly 60 when his duties with the Esterhazy family ceased. Salomon, a famous violinist and conductor who lived in London and had often produced symphonies by Haydn and Mozart at his concerts, had long tried to get Haydn to visit England. When he heard that the death of Prince Esterhazy had released Haydn from his appointment, he hurried to Vienna and brought Haydn back to London with him. Haydn lived most of the time of his visit in Lisson Grove, which was then quite in the country. His fame was so great outside Austria that directly he arrived in London, ambassadors and noblemen called on him, and everyone was anxious to know him and do him honor. He was made a doctor of music at Oxford. He was a guest at Guildhall banquets, and his music was played at numberless concerts. His portrait, painted by Hoppner while he was in England, is now at Hampton Court. There is one of Haydn's compositions that is very familiar to English people, and that is the Austrian national anthem. It was one of his favorite tunes, and he used it in one of his quartets. There are other works of Haydn's that English people too know well, and those are his two oratorios, The Creation and The Seasons, which he wrote quite late in life. After having paid 2 visits to London, Haydn settled at last in Vienna, where he was now famous. During the last few years of his long life, he became weaker and unable to work, but he lived very contentedly, and when Vienna was bombarded and occupied by the French, he showed great calm and courage. The last visit he received was from a French officer who sang one of his songs to him, and the last piece Haydn himself played, only a few days before his death, was the Emperor's Hymn, the national anthem he had composed. Beethoven was a pupil of Haydn's for a short time and played one of his concertos. And at Haydn's last appearance in Vienna, Beethoven was present and embraced him in public. In those days, as we have seen, musicians were really servants of the noblemen for whom they worked and in whose house they lived. But Haydn was independent in character and was very conscious of the dignity of his artistic position. He only wore the prince's uniform when actually conducting. He even reproved the prince if he found fault with what Haydn felt was his province. Benevolent, good-natured, very kind-hearted and generous, very appreciative of other people's work, and always working to make his own better, he learnt until the end of his life. He was most open-minded. When other musicians criticized passages in Mozart's music, he would answer, Art is free. If Mozart wrote this, he had a good reason for it. Haydn did not talk of music much, but he had very clear ideas of his own. He realized that melody, really tuneful themes, was the charm of music, and a charm that only real genius can produce. Few musicians can write really beautiful melodies. One of the wonders of Haydn's music is its fresh, spontaneous feeling and the care with which it is written. And the wonder is all the greater when we realize that he wrote more than 150 symphonies with beautiful slow movements, gay and delicate minuets, interesting and developed first and last movements. Also, 77 quartets, each with several movements. And besides all these, a great deal of music for other orchestral instruments, for the clavier, for the organ, and also a number of light operas for performance by the small company employed by Prince Esterhazy, together with oratorios and many songs for solo and chorus. In view of his development of the art of writing for orchestra, Haydn is always considered the father of modern music. The private orchestras, when Haydn lived, were usually small, and the instruments used were strings, flutes, oboes, bassoons, horns, trumpets, and drums. The strings are a part of the orchestra with which everyone is familiar. The first violin seated on the left-hand side of the conductor, and the principal violin player considered as the leader of the whole orchestra. The second violin seated usually on the right. The violas, the slightly larger violin with deeper tone, able to make beautiful deep sounds of its own. The cellos, the same shape, but so large that they are played held between the knees of the player, and the double basses of such size that the players have to stand to play them. The flute is a well-known instrument, and we recognize it by sight in an orchestra when we see it held sideways to the player's mouth, and we recognize the sound by its high, clear notes of soft, breathing quality. The oboes are not usually so well known by sight, but their peculiar quality of sound is easily recognized, for they give rather penetrating sound like a shepherd's pipe. Whenever people imagine a pastoral dance with shepherd's piping, it is an oboe of which they think. The bassoon is a low or bass oboe, so if wind instruments play together, the bassoon takes the lowest part, but its higher notes are very beautiful. Haydn, who understood it very well, wrote beautiful solo passages for it. Flutes, oboes, and bassoons are all instruments of wood and are called the woodwind of the orchestra. Horns are easily recognized by sight, being made of brass, and their long tube curved round in a circle with its wide bell-like opening at one end. They are very easily seen among other instruments. Horns give a full, soft tone, and they often hold long notes, while other instruments play more moving passages. They thus make a good body of sound, which combines very well with other instruments, and does not contrast too much with them. Trumpets and drums are familiar to everyone. We know the brilliant sound of trumpets in military trumpet calls, and we recognize what beautiful effects can be made with their brilliance in works by such composers as Purcell, Bach, and Handel. Anyone who listens to an orchestral work by Bach and then to one of Haydn's symphonies will realize what a difference there is between them. In Bach's work, if an instrument plays at all, it probably plays from beginning to end of the piece, and the piece has therefore one kind of sound throughout. But in a Haydn symphony there are endless surprises. While the strings are playing, the woodwind instruments will come in unexpectedly for a short passage, and there are constant feelings of freshness from the use of different instruments. Some instruments stomp, others play, and the quality of the sound varies all the time. Bach had written works for instruments, as had A. Scarlatti, in several movements, but in Haydn's work these movements became much more diversified and tuneful. The first movement in sonata form with different themes makes an important and interesting beginning. Then comes a slow movement, quiet usually and with effects of great feeling. Then a third movement in the form of a minuet, And in Haydn's and his successors' work, the minuet was a light, gay, tuneful dance, one of the most charming moments in the work. Lastly, a fourth movement, important but light in character, making a dignified end to the whole work. Haydn's genius was so great that his works became a model for composers after him, and his music was so sincere and beautiful that it is still treasured and enjoyed by everyone who loves music. End of section 12 of Music by Ursula Creighton. Read by Martha Weller, Champaign, Illinois, February 29, 2024.